welcome to everyone who's joining us in our webinar today to talk about displacement and graphic novels. Welcome to the Newburyport Literary Festival. My name is Leslie Hendrickson. I'm on the steering committee of the festival, and even though I can't see you, I am so glad you're here. We are excited about the festival this year. This is our second day and our second year online, but our 16th edition of the festival. We're hoping to be back in person next year, but we've been fortunate that this format allows us to bring a lot of new and different authors to the festival, and we have more than 100 participants this year, which is our biggest festival ever. Just a couple things. We're using the webinar format. You can see and hear the panelists, but we won't be able to see you. So if you have comments, please put them in the chat. Tell us where you're from, if you're new to the festival, if you've been to the festival every year since it started. But if you have questions, please put the questions in the Q&A tab, because that helps keep them organized and lets the presenters see them more clearly. You probably heard yesterday was Independent Bookstore Day, and of course we want to support our independent bookstore partners. Links to the bookstores, the Bookshop of Beverly Farms and Jabberwocky Bookshop in Newburyport will be in the chat, and they have all the books from authors in the festivals. I'll also put the website for the literary festival in the chat, just in case you haven't seen it and you want to attend a couple more events this afternoon. We have a few more after this. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Kiku Hughes, who is a cartoonist and an illustrator based in the Seattle area. Her work has been featured in Beyond Anthology Volumes 1 and 2, Short Box, and Team Avatar Tales. Her first graphic novel, Displacement, was published by First Second in 2020. Elizabeth Abraham is a technology startup executive, artist, and educator. She is non-monogamous when it comes to books and can often be seen reading multiple books at once in a variety of formats. She can be found discussing all things books and creative journaling on YouTube, and I will attach her handle for YouTube. I will put it in the chat. And so without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Leslie. So today we're going to be talking about this book. Okay, you can see the author, but as I was talking to the author a little bit earlier, Kiku and I believe that the last time people tend to have read comics, usually it's when you were young, or you think of superheroes. And we are here today to tell you the world of graphic novels and comics is not what you remember. And we want to get you excited about picking up comics. And if you want to, this would be a good place to start, is Displacement. So Kiku, I'm so excited to be talking to you. And I'd like to just start with, for people who have not read the book, can you give us a quick overview of what is the story about? What's the context?
Yeah, and thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being here and Leslie for hosting this. So yeah, Displacement is a story of a fictionalized teenage version of myself being pulled back in time to experience Japanese American incarceration alongside my grandmother, who was 16 when World War II started and was forced from her home in San Francisco to camp in the desert of Utah called Topaz. And it's a story about discovering sort of lost family history and the lasting impact of these, great community traumas and the power of memory in sort of reclaiming that history.
Okay, great. And what was the inspiration? So what is it about this story that actually got you to, okay, I need to kind of do this story. I need to write this book.
Yeah, so you might have noticed if you've read the book that there's a lot of references to the 2016 election in the book. And that was actually the event that sort of started me thinking, okay, more concretely, it is something that I've wanted to explore for a really long time in my art. That my grandmother's time at camp, but the 2016 election, there was a lot of rhetoric that was brought up that really mobilized the Japanese American community specifically to speak up more about our experiences or our family's experiences during World War II, and to talk about the ways in which sort of racist fear mongering in very specific ways is the lead up to more dramatic and more traumatic events like incarceration camps. And so a lot of Japanese Americans sort of came together in the wake of the 2016 election and formed organizations like Sewer for Solidarity, which is an organization that is working to close the camps that are on the southern border and free the children from detention centers there. And sort of focused around this shared history of, being descendants of people who were unjustly incarcerated in that way. So it became, the 2016 election really became sort of a part of Japanese American history and of the history of camps in that way.
Okay, great. So because this is a visual format, I think it would really help people to see what they're looking at. So if you wouldn't mind just giving us an example or a sampler of what they can expect to see when they open up the book.
Absolutely. And so I'll just have this sort of slideshow running if you want to
Great.
continue. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so so when we look at the graphics, I mean, so one of the questions I would have is, there's so many ways you decide, there's so many creative decisions that get made into putting together something, anything, but when you're talking specifically about a comic or a graphic novel, and I would be curious for you to share some of that. What were some of the creative decisions you had to make, and how did you arrive at, for example, the color palette? Is very distinctive. I mean, I happen to love it. But if you look at comics, they range from very dark to very light to very cutesy or very, very urban. And I was just curious in terms of how you thought about the story you were trying to convey and the stylistic choices you made along the way.
Yeah, a lot of my stylistic choices really come from what is fastest for me personally. When you're making a book that's 270 pages of drawings, you kind of have to economize, I guess, and figure out the best way to sort of speed it along. So I definitely stuck with a style that was more comfortable for me. But the color palette was certainly something that took a lot of experimentation. And I didn't set out with the intention of making a sort of, I guess, vintage look, but I think it kind of ended up that way. And a lot of that came from, I was actually lucky enough to be able to visit the site of Topaz in just outside of town called Delta, Utah. And I was able to take a lot of pictures there and sort of get a sense of, the color palette of the area. And a lot of it was just very gray and white, with very blue sky, very white, gray earth. There wasn't a lot of dramatic color in the area. And I think that sort of translated to how I ended up, picking my palette for the book, was sort of wanting to keep it kind of neutral in order to really, I don't know, convey this sort of starkness of the landscape. So maybe I can go back to the San Francisco scenes, where I tried to give it a little bit more life and more brightness in the present day and in San Francisco, versus sort of back in time when there's just a little bit more of this sort of neutral palette. But yeah, if that answers your question.
No, but it is. I think that you do such an effective job of that, right? Because I think a lot, when you're reading a comic, so much of what's happening is visual, as opposed to when you're reading something in print or in prose, right? Because the author has to basically paint it with words. And I think there's a power to looking at something that's visual. And I think a lot of times people skip, they kind of skim the pictures. And to me, the illustrations capture so much that you don't have to put all these words around. And I think in this particular case, you very successfully show kind of the light when she's in Phil, and then the bleakness. And it's almost external and internal bleakness with the muted color palette. And I think that was just so effectively done in terms of how you did that.
Thank you so much. But and yeah, you brought up a great point. One thing that I really love about graphic novels is the ability to, spend whole pages without any dialogue, without any text, and be able to just really convey a lot of meaning without having to have the reader, actually read, but they can just sit with the page, and sort of, I don't know, the silence of that is really powerful to me.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it is like, so here's a perfect example of the page you're just showing us, right? There is so much conveyed in this page, just in this one illustration. You've got kind of a wide angle view of what the character is seeing, and then you have close-up shots of very specific things. And you get such a sense of what she was experiencing. It almost feels tactile when you have this wide angle with kind of, a close-ups along the way as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I was just curious as well. So how much of this history, because I know you personally are connected with your family, how much of this history did you know coming into this research? How much of it did you ever learn about this in school? And then just what would that involve? What was the process like for you?
Yeah. So my grandmother died before I was born, and that actually informed a lot of the way that I went about structuring the narrative of displacement. Because one of the things that is kind of complicated is that I didn't feel like I had any right to actually characterize my grandmother as a woman that I never met, but my mom had met, obviously, and her siblings had. So one of the sort of I don't know, goals of my character in the book is to work up the courage to actually introduce herself to the stranger who is her grandmother. And I wasn't, spoiler alert, I guess, but she never actually gets to do that, because there's this distance that I always knew that I kind of had to maintain in order to be authentic and not seem disrespectful. But the things that I did know going into it actually informed sort of the narrative structure of the book itself. So I had grown up knowing that my grandmother was in camp, and there were specific events that I had grown up knowing as well. I knew about the horse stalls, for example. I knew that it was dusty. That was one thing that was very, that I'd always grown up hearing. I knew about things like the murder of James Wakasa, like the loyalty questionnaire. These are all major plot points in the book. And I decided to make them these major plot points in the book because they were things that even through generations of silence and of kind of repression, I guess, they were still passed down to me in a way that I felt like made them these really pivotal moments in my grandmother's life, so much so they broke through these barriers of silence. So that formed sort of the tent poles of the story for me.
Okay, that's great. And actually, you brought up the loyalty question, and that's the question, and that's one of the questions I have for you today. And there are people who are listening who might not be aware of that. This is, I mean, the book very effectively talks about it because you actually have the language in the questionnaire. I'd be curious if you could just help people who do not know about the history. What was the loyalty questionnaire, and what was the tension that created in the community?
Yeah, so around, I think it was a year into incarceration, the government decided to deploy something they called a loyalty questionnaire, which they thought would help them determine who among the Japanese Americans were actually loyal to America and who were secretly Japanese Empire spies, which sounds ridiculous because the entire thing is, like, if you are a spy, you would be writing on your loyalty questionnaire, well, yes, I am a spy. Sorry about that. But it asked a series of questions that I guess they thought they could read between the lines. I actually was able to read my great-grandfather's answers to the loyalty questionnaire by getting his documents from the National Archives. And the questions on it were things like, what magazines do you subscribe to? what organizations have you donated to in the last 10 years or whatever? And these were things that they thought they could use to demonstrate a citizen's or a non-citizens, in the case of the first generation Japanese who were not allowed to become citizens, their loyalty to America. But the real contentious part of the loyalty questionnaire were two questions, number 27 and number 28. The first of which asked if, well, I don't remember exactly which one is which, but the first of which asked if the person would be willing to or serve in the United States Army, or if you were a woman in the Women's Auxiliary Corps. And the second of which asked if you were willing to renounce all allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. And this caused a lot of turmoil in the community because, first of all, the Issei, the first generation Japanese, were not allowed to become citizens of the US because there was specifically racist immigration laws that did not allow citizenship to these first generation Japanese Americans. So they believed, and rightly so, I think, that if they renounced loyalty to Japan, they would be stateless. They would have absolutely no citizenship anywhere, which is a precarious place to be, especially when there were threats of deporting people back to Japan. And for the second generation, for people that were born in America, they had never had any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. So they felt that it was sort of a trick question meant to catch them, to say, aha, I knew you had an allegiance, when they never did. So there was all this debate and contention about these questions, which the government had no idea about. And they were like, just answer the question. Why are you so upset? Because the government had no idea the sort of precarious situation that they had put, 120,000 people in. So the people who answered no to both questions, no, they wouldn't volunteer for the army, because in some cases it was because they did want to volunteer for a country that had locked them up unjustly. In other cases, there are myriad reasons why you might not want to volunteer for the army. So people who voted no, or who said no on both questions, were labeled no boys, and many of them were then taken to a more strict camp called Tule Lake, which eventually ended up having a lot more military intervention, a lot of military lockdowns, things like that. So Tule Lake was, a punishment in ways. And it sort of divided the community in a lot of ways, the loyalty questionnaire.
Yeah, I mean, it was absolutely one of the parts of the book that I did not know about that stiff point in this history. And it really struck me in that, you got the bureaucracy, if you will, putting a questionnaire in place without recognizing you have put people in, as you just said, such a precarious situation, right? You've uprooted them, you've taken away their rights, essentially. And the first generation haven't been granted citizenship. Now, how do you answer that question, right? I mean, and it's just that people didn't think that through in terms of what are the ramifications for the people that you've asked, because you can see how whoever put that questionnaire together, it seemed very logical, but not really understanding, who's the person on the other side who has to answer this. And it's a very nuanced response. Of course it is. It's not a black or white situation there.
It also really demonstrates the fact that people in the US government believed that even American citizens who were born in America and had never been to Japan had a loyalty to the Emperor of Japan innately, as if that is something that you're born with. Yeah, it really demonstrates the biases that were in the government at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one that I was like, wow, it just goes to show how much, when you don't have advocates working with the government on certain issues, these things get lost along the way. So one of the questions, another one I have for you is, this is an interesting mix of fact and fiction. So you chose not to make it purely fiction. You chose not to make it purely nonfiction. You've kind of walked this line. And I'd be curious to hear about making that decision, and where is that line? So for people reading this, where is that line that you chose to draw and said, okay, here's where I'm going to go fact and here's where I'm going to go fiction? I mean, the displacement notwithstanding, right? Because that's obvious.
Yeah, and actually it is obvious for a reason. I wanted to create something that immediately put the reader in a state of, I guess, understanding that this is not 100% historical fact. And the reason that I wanted to do that is, again, because I didn't know my grandmother, because there are so many parts of her story and of even the story in general of Japanese American incarceration that have been lost um, for various reasons. Uh, I wanted to emphasize the importance of a community's memory of an event um, as more important and more, I guess, concrete than what we might consider historical fact. And for example, one thing that I think might demonstrate this is the fact that Japanese Americans, when they were first taken to camp, were not allowed to bring cameras. And any photographs that were taken of camp were highly regulated by the WRA, by the War Relocation Authority. So you had people like Ansel Adams coming in and taking pictures, I think it was Ansel Adams, Dorothy Lang, taking pictures of the camp, but they were very censored. They were very, they were directed. They were meant to show a sort of happy environment. And so that is the historical, like, primary source material that we have, is this very edited, highly regulated, government controlled narrative. And at a certain level, that is not as reliable as, a community's memory of the events, and these sort of secondhand sources that are passed down through generations, I think, share a more authentic truth than the primary source facts. So I did try to do a lot of research, of course, and there are thankfully a lot of organizations like Densho, which are archiving these stories of first-person accounts of camp and documents and things like that. But I wanted to de-emphasize the importance of these sort of hard historical facts, especially in a story where so much of those, historical documents are so heavily edited and censored.
Yeah, especially because, we all know there's the power of who tells the story and who owns that story is really powerful. And it, as you just said, having a community talk about something is very different than having an official record about something, right? Because there's this way that we try to cover something up or make it seem better than it was at that time. So yeah, I think that's just an interesting choice there. Now, in terms of the displacement, I know you have a nod to Octavia Butler, and I wonder if you just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Octavia Butler was a Black woman who wrote incredible sci-fi novels. She's actually from the Seattle area, yay. And reading her novel Kindred in college was a real turning point for me in understanding the power of these sci-fi tropes. So Kindred is definitely what influenced Displacement. In Kindred, a Black woman in the 70s, I believe, is pulled back in time to the antebellum South, where her ancestors were enslaved. And her experience obviously is very different. And her relationship with these time travel moments are very different than what I ended up doing in Displacement. But the concept of time travel as community trauma, as community memory, was so powerful, and she did things like that in every book she did. She took these sci-fi tropes that you have, like alien abduction, like time travel, like all these classic sci-fi tropes, and really changed them in ways that are so interesting and so unique. So she really revealed to me that these sci-fi things that I really loved, and sci-fi has always been my favorite genre, can work in such interesting ways and tell really cool stories.
No, I agree. I think it's such a powerful way without, it feels like beating someone over the head with something. And I think that's one of the disadvantages to sometimes nonfiction about a particular topic or fiction about a particular topic. As opposed to in the sci-fi context, you've taken any particular group out of the equation. So whatever your bias coming into that story is no longer there, right? You're looking at this alien life form, or these people have tentacles. I mean, so you're much more open. You're the prejudices you come to a story with or a situation with get diffused without you even being aware of it. I think that's such a powerful way to get people thinking through, what do you think about this situation without the baggage you bring to it? You know, I just think that's
Yeah.
so great. So we've got a couple of questions and I wanted to kind of go through those. So someone asked, do you think that graphic novels are a good entry point for more reluctant school age readers?
You know, I've heard that, and I don't know that firsthand, but I do think it does make a story more accessible for people who, you know, maybe struggle with reading or who are just disinterested in long prose. I think it can sort of give people an entryway, like I want to know what's happening in this picture, etc.
Mhm.
I think it can, and not just, you know, younger readers, but also older readers who might not necessarily want to read or have time to read a prose novel.
Absolutely. So my own personal experience would be the answer is absolutely yes from my limited perspective. One is I've also done teaching, and so you know, kids who feel like a book is too thick, pictures is an entry point that's easier. I had a nephew who was a reluctant reader when he was younger, and his parents kept saying, you know, we don't want him, quote unquote, wasting time on comics, right? And the thing is, that's what made him the reader that he is today, is because he found his way in something that he was interested in that didn't have, you know, a 600-page, you know, all text document that he had to kind of, he felt like plow his way through. It felt like too much like homework. And I think especially with comics like this that have got some historical pieces built in, I think it's such a great way to learn about something without feeling like, oh my goodness, I have to do a book report about this when I'm done, you know?
And
So,
yeah, and the other thing I think that I really want to emphasize too is that uh, looking at pictures, looking at a comic panel is a different form of reading. It is reading. It is
yes.
interpreting what you're seeing, and really, you know, it takes it's a different kind of literacy, but it is still, you know, advancing a skill. And I think that can't be understated.
Mhm. Another question is, what has the reaction to your book been from the Japanese American community?
Yeah, it's been really great, and it's been very touching, I guess. And I'm lucky enough to, you know, be in the same city as like organizations like Densho, which have been really supportive. And you know, hearing from people also who are fourth generation Japanese American or Japanese Canadian, who also have the similar feeling of not quite knowing everything about this history, and sort of the complicated process of rediscovering it, or drawing stories out from our relatives. It's been really heartening to sort of share that experience with a lot of people, because one of the consequences of Japanese American incarceration was, you know, really the dissolution of a lot of Japantowns, of a lot of Japanese American community centers. For example, my family went, you know, my grandmother was taken from San Francisco and had to move to New York for school to leave camp. And she never made it back to San Francisco. So, you know, there's this disconnect in a lot of Japanese Americans who didn't return to their place of origin after camp, and a sort of a feeling of separation from the community. So it was really cool hearing people say like, oh, I feel so, you know, seen by this character's struggle to reconnect with that community.
Yeah, I think representation is so important. I think we understand so much more of that today than I think we've ever had. And seeing something that you can relate to is so important on the page. I have a question from Meg who asks, if there was one question you would ask your grandmother if she were here today, what would that be?
Oh, that's a big one.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Oh, you know, I think I've wanted to know for a really long time, and it's kind of a cerebral question, I guess, but I wanted to know if she was happy.
Mm.
She had a really hard life, and I think I know a lot of her through the hardships that I sort of think about. But I would love to know, if she was happy, if she felt good about, where she ended up, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Cindy wants to know, how did you learn to do illustrations and how did you develop your style?
Yeah, it's a question I think a lot of art focused people get. And it's a
Yes.
hard one to answer because it's a lifelong pursuit, I guess. I've drawn my whole life pretty much with a few breaks. But in terms of style, I think, again, reading comics and reading and looking at other people's illustrations and developing a sort of literacy around reading comics is such a huge part of developing your own style. It's really seeing how other people are approaching it and identifying, I like this specific thing about what this artist is doing. I like how this artist draws their hair or whatever, and sort of fixating on that and trying to recreate it in your own way is a big part of developing a style, I think. But yeah, in terms of art, I've been doodling my whole life, and I was an English major in college, but I always wanted to be drawing while I was reading. So
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. I think it's something that everybody wants to know. It's like, okay, how did you learn how to do this? And the character, your character in the story actually has a sketchbook with her when she gets displaced. And I thought it was interesting in that in the present day, we never see her with a sketchbook. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, that's true. And part of it is that one of the main sources that I used for displacement as a primary resource was, and I always forget the title number, Citizen 13660, I believe is the number, by Mina Ukubo. And it is a first person account, a visual diary, illustrated diary that she kept while in Topaz. And it is an incredible resource. And it really cements, comics and visual narration as a part of telling the story in history, which I think is really cool. But she was an art teacher in Topaz, and I really wanted to give a nod to her in the book. So I have my character sort of be in her class and have her encourage my character to draw what she sees, because that's what Mina Yakubo was doing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And speaking of nods, let's talk about the queer angle here. So again, it's one of those things that gets written out, right? Because there's all these different things when you're trying to, when communities are trying to present something, it's very easy to edit out or redact out things that the community itself does not feel comfortable with or want to talk about. So can you talk a little bit about your choice to actually make the character queer, as well as, I know there's a nod to a guy whose name I cannot remember now, but I'm sure you'll tell us about it.
Yeah. So I myself am a lesbian, so I my character is as well. And the guy that I think you're talking about is Jiro Onuma, who
Yes.
was he's the most documented gay man in camp. And we have photographs of him with his boyfriend in Topaz, actually. So I put him in as a cameo in some places. But yeah, but you're right. I think, even, now I think there's some hesitancy in Japanese American circles, not just with queer stories, but with other parts of the narrative. There were mixed race kids who also, their narrative is really taken out, especially if they were not mixed with white, if they were half Filipino or half Chinese or half Black. You don't hear those stories as much because there's still a lot of baggage in the Japanese American community about, different narratives, I guess. But specifically with the queer narrative, I'm very grateful to a lot of queer scholars who have actually dug up these histories, like Jiro Onuma, and really shown, we've always been here. we were there in camp, and people found ways to be happy and to find each other and to fall in love and to spend that time together. I really recommend looking up Jiro Onuma. There's a really great picture of him and his boyfriend, and they're smiling and they're having, a great time. I mean, not a great time, but still.
Yes, yes. Yeah, but and I think there's a couple of dance scenes in here. The community gets together for dances, and so the Kiku and May have a dance. You've got these two women, but in several of them, the background has got two men. And again, like I said, if you just skim and just look at the forefront of what that image shows, you miss all these things that you're putting in kind of nods to in the background, which I was delighted by that too. I was like, oh wait, there's something else going on here that doesn't get mentioned overtly, but it's kind of slipped into the storyline as well.
And that's part of visual literacy, I think. Once you key into certain details. It was actually funny. That was one of the few things I had to kind of fight my editors on. But I actually was able to sort of go through a lot of black and white photos of 1940s dances and be like, look, people were dancing with people of the same gender. It wasn't a huge deal.
Yeah, I know. Again, it's like, it's I think there's this fear of if you put that in, you're going to alienate certain readers. And I actually find that the opposite is true, especially the way you've done it, where some of that is background. It's not necessarily foreground. I just think that's such a great way. We're coming close to time, so a couple of things I'd like to talk about, and this is a big one, but I know we'll try and get to it in a couple of minutes. So in the blurb of your book, you've got this concept of intergenerational impacts of trauma and the redemptive power of memory. And I think when we talk about trauma, intergenerational trauma is not something that gets talked about often, just kind of in a wider context. It's almost like this individual and that individual. And I'd be curious what your thoughts were on that, especially as it pertains to the Japanese American community.
Yeah, so part of the process of researching for displacement, which at first, I kind of thought of as a straightforward telling of the story of my grandmother's life. I would pinpoint these moments where it kind of explained certain things. Like I'd grown up, again, feeling alienated from Japanese American communities, not being able to speak Japanese, having these, moments where I'm kind of figuring out why Japanese was not passed down in my family, why, specific things were not talked about. And realizing that that decision to not teach my mom Japanese was so conscious on the part of my grandmother because of, this trauma that she experienced. And in that way, she's passing it down in a specific way that she may not even realize, that stays with you and to a point where, I took Japanese in high school because I wanted to read things that we had in our house that nobody could read. And that kind of made me realize, like, I guess that is a very physical and tangible thing that I live with that is directly linked to this trauma that my grandmother had. And that's sort of a abstract thing. There's a lot of research now that says that, these big community traumas actually has a biological effect on generations for 2-3 generations down. But I think a lot of people are more understanding these specific ways that, these big moments of community trauma affect later generations. And that's a big thing that I wanted to make sure Displacement talked about.
And I think it's so important too, because especially with any wave of immigrants that come to the US, there's this, the first generation is so focused on back home, right? There's this connection to back home. And the generation that grew up or was born or was younger when they came here, and I can speak from the South Asian perspective, is they're trying to just fit in. They're throwing everything out with the bathwater, right? You don't want to stick out. It's hard enough. You don't need any additional barriers to fitting in. And with that, there's a loss, so it happens on both cases, because I can certainly see adults making decisions that they think will help their children, but there's this disconnect from the culture in terms of language or in terms of, a variety of other things. There's always things that stay, right? Food is an interesting one. It almost kind of never goes away.
Yeah.
But yeah, but other cultural things tend to become complicated. And I think you have to become older to appreciate the things you didn't want to even think about when you're a teenager, right? It's like, I just want to be like everybody else, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So, okay. So we are going to kind of get to wrapping up, and I'm going to have you read the very final paragraph. So there's kind of this kind of bringing us back to today, and I'm going to have you read that little section we talked about a little earlier, because I think, people, there's this whole conversation, and we started having that around 2016, is this notion of, it cannot happen here. It didn't happen here. It wouldn't happen here. And even though our own American history has got examples of this, I don't think we think that that is, that's past. It would never happen again. And so I think this little paragraph you've got, this little section, I think so clearly is in some ways a call to, hey, wake up, right? So if you would please go ahead and do that.
Sure, thank you. The persecution of a marginalized group of people is never just one act of violence. It's a condemnation of generations to come who live with the ongoing consequences. We may suffer from these traumas, but we can also use them to help others and fight for justice in our own time. Memories are powerful things.
That's fantastic. And speaking of memories, your mother in real life and your mother in the comic, how aligned were they?
I think in the comic, I forced my mom and I to have more honest and open conversations than I think we usually did. But other than that, I think it's pretty authentic.
Okay.
There's a lot that she didn't know either. And one of the things about this book that really meant a lot to me was being able to share my research with her and tell her things about her own mother that she had never been able to talk to her about. And us sort of discovering that together was really meaningful.
No, it is. And it's a gift too, right? Because I think a lot of times you don't know what to ask. You don't know how to ask it. And a lot of times it takes us getting older to even be able to care or be even remotely interested in the history, right? And then by that point, that generation might not be around to answer the questions that we have. So I think that's really great. Kiku, this has been really wonderful. Is there one takeaway, one thing you would like everyone to be aware of before we wrap up that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, that we haven't talked about yet. I think one thing that I do regret about the book is that it's so rooted in the 2016 election that it almost makes it seem as though these kinds of issues, that the camps at the borders, are completely over. But that's not true. There are still children being held in detention camps that are separated from their families at the border, and at various immigration centers around the US. And I think my one takeaway is abolish ICE and reunite children with their families. And yeah. And it's still a problem, so we still have to fight for it. Yes.
Yes. So the image you have up on screen right now is kind of where that section is. It's kind of the very last page of the comic, and I think it just, as you said, just really highlights the call. It's a call to action in some ways as well, and I think that's important for all of us to remember. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Kiku Hughes. The book again that we've been discussing is Displacement. Highly recommend picking up a copy, hopefully from your local independent bookstore. And if you have any other questions, Kiku, where could people find you?
You can find me, I'm on Twitter at Kiku Hughes, and that's usually where I am. I don't have a lot of other contact information.
Okay, great. Well, it's been delightful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
This was great. Thank you both so much. Elizabeth, great questions. Kiku, amazing art. And we hope to see more of your work in the future. Thank you again. And thank you to all the participants for showing up and your great questions. A couple more events this afternoon for the Newburyport Literary Festival, but all around we've had a great weekend and we really appreciate all of you spending your time with us. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Bye.